Well, welcome back to the Steve Max Muscle Car Show podcast. We are now sponsored by High Octane Classics, the Northeast's largest muscle car and supercar dealership located at 143rd Washington Street in Auburn, Massachusetts, also known as 143 Washington Street in Auburn, Mass. High Octane Classics buys and sells and services muscle cars and exotics. You can call them at 508-859-4515. Now, we're picking up the ball here. Today is August 29th, 2021, and myself and Chris Roberts, my right-hand man, my producer, we're picking up and we're continuing. We've been down for, about a month and a half, something like that, while arranging for High Octane Classics to sponsor the show, which is really cool, and just kind of enjoying the summer off a little bit. But we're back. And, of course, what we do on this show, as you know, is we read from my book, Steve Magnotti's 1001 Muscle Car Facts, which was produced back in, I think 2009 or something like that. It's been a while, and this book has been a pretty good seller for Car Tech Books. And this again, 2013, of course, is when this came out. And it was followed by Steve Magnotti's 1001 Mustang Facts, I think the next year, 2014. And then about 2 years after that, in 2018, I did Steve Magnotti's 1001 Corvette Facts. And what's different about this show is that this particular episode, which is episode 39, we're now doing a live stream. So the podcast has become a video as well as an audio experience. And again, if you're just listening with your radio or your podcast device and you can't see it, that's okay. It's still going to be mostly an audio experience. So let's get that ball rolling. We're now into the Ford and Mercury chapter of my book, and we're going to start it up with fact number 558, which is from the engine and driveline part of the book. So fact number 558 begins with, here we go. Okay. In 1981, law enforcement agencies faced a horsepower crisis, and Mercury reacted as best it could. Shared with the Ford LTD police package, police spec Marquis were available with a new 351 cubic inch weapon in 1981, the high-output 351 Windsor, making 20 horsepower and 15 foot-pounds more than the civilian 351 offering. The added output, which totaled 165 horsepower at 3,600 RPM and 285 foot-pounds of torque at 2,200 RPM, compared to the standard 351's 145 horsepower and 270 foot-pounds, resulted from a dual catalytic converter, dual exhaust system, and marine-sourced camshaft. In production for 36 consecutive years, the Grand Marquis was Mercury's longest-running production model. The final Mercury Grand Marquis left Ford's St. Thomas assembly plant in Ontario, Canada on January 4th, 2011. Now, of course, the last of the Marquis, like their, I believe, LTD counterparts, or Crown Victoria, counterparts, were based on the Panther platform. But back then, in 1981, the modular motor, the 4.6 and the 5.4, all those great Camrys that arrived in the 1990s and later, weren't around. And the big Ford 351 was as good as things got in 1981. In fact, the 460s and all those hot dog engines from the supercar 70s and 60s were pretty much a thing of the past. So small block only, the 351. How far we have come. Okay, let's move on. Fact 559. We know that Ford reacted to the law enforcement horsepower crisis with the nifty Mustang SSP, Special Service Package, of 1982 through 1993. But did the Fox body Mustang's Mercury Capri stablemate ever strap on a holster and badge? Well, the 1982 to 1986 Capri RS certainly could have been as useful, perhaps even more so, because its bubble-like glass hatch was better suited to hauling police equipment. But it wasn't. Even though Mercury matched the 78 through 83 Ford Fairmont police package with its own Zephyr law enforcement package, the Capri was never sworn into police duty. Now, if you lived here in New England, or well, even in California, really all over the country, you might remember those little two-door Mustang sedans with their dual exhaust pipes coming out the back, and state police markings on them all over the country. But again, Mercury never played along, so there was never a Capri version of the SSP. Would have been cool. Okay, moving on. Fact number 560. The Y-block engine family was only in passenger car production for 9 model years, in contrast to 21 years for the flathead V8 that preceded it and 20 years for the FE big block that followed it. So why was this engine family produced for such a comparatively brief period? Well, the answer is lack of growth potential. The Detroit horsepower race wasn't predicted when the Ford Mercury engineers began planning the Y-block in 1949, and so gave it a modest 4.63-inch bore spacing measurement. Exactly 4.63 inches of distance separate the center line of one cylinder bore to the next. In this scenario, cylinder bores can only be enlarged so much and still leave sufficient room for thick walls and coolant passages. Thus, without adding the cost of tall deck block castings or the wear-inducing geometry of a stroker crank, Ford deemed 312 cubic inches as the safe limit, nowhere near the 400 cubic inches needed to match the competition. Supercharging helped 1957 Ford only, never on a Mercury, but was costly. The solution was the start from scratch 1958 FE family, which began at 332 and 352 cubic inches, and they eventually grew into 428 cubic inches. So yeah, that's the deal on the Ford Y-block, made famous probably in Thunderbirds, 1955, 6, and 7. The 292 and 312 V8 was found in Thunderbirds. And of course, we have to remember the Ford Y-block, which debuted in 1954, was a replacement for the flathead V8 of 1953 back to 32. The difference, of course, being the overhead valve construction, where there's push rods, rocker arms, and ultimately much better intake and exhaust ports versus the flathead, which had its intake ports and exhaust ports in part molded into the block. So that thing was pretty asthmatic from scratch. But the Y-block was at least a step in the right direction, but again, cursed by its very compact bore spacing dimension. 312 was as big as things could get. Now I know some strokers of those, I think we've seen 340 cubic inches with aftermarket strokers and stuff, but you're not going to go 400 cube with a Y-block ever without making it so thin and so weak that it might only last one pass. Okay, moving on from page 221 to page 222, we transition from the engine compartment, or engine chapter, if you will, to the segment on suspension and brakes. So let's begin with fact 561. Though based on the same platform as the stock 1965 Ford Mustang, Mercury devised a very different front suspension configuration for use in its mini fleet of 427-powered AFX 427 Comet Cyclones. To accommodate the extra width of the Cammer 427 engine in the Falcon-based Mustang engine bay, Holman and Moody eliminated the intrusive spring and shock towers entirely and devised a novel torsion-leaf front suspension layout. By contrast, Bill Strope Engineering in Long Beach, California, removed the stock spring and shock towers, but instead of going to horizontally positioned torsion-leaf springs from Holman and Moody, Strope moved the stock spring and shock towers to the outsides of the fender walls and retained the tall coil springs. Some juggling of the lower control arm anchor points and extra-length forged spindles completed the picture with room to spare under the hood. Ironically, a shortage of 427 Cammer engines caused the quartet of cars delivered to Ed Sharpman, Ed Rashinsky, Bill Lagana, and Moyer Mercury to be delivered with standard pushrod-equipped 427 high-riser wedges. By contrast, the cars delivered to Don Nicholson, Arnie Beswick, Hayden Proffitt, and George DeLorean were packed with 427 single overhead cam superstar power. Still, all 8 cars, even the wedge head cars, were modified with the outboard located front coil springs to ease subsequent fitment of cammer power. An excellent overview of Don Nicholson's as delivered 1965 single overhead cam Cyclone was printed in the April 1965 issue of Hot Rod magazine. Yeah, it's true. The 65 fleet of 427 Comets were initially envisioned with the big, wide 427 Cammer, but again, a shortage of engines resulted in several of them being delivered with the wedge, which had push rods and not as much breathing potential, but still it was a very potent weapon against the Mopar Hemi cars and the independent GM big block 396 powered funny cars. These things would have met on the strip. Okay, let's move on to fact 562 with more Cyclone Funny Car, or FX Facts. Here we go. Thanks to its diminutive external dimensions, the small block 289 BFX Cyclone fleet retains stock Comet front suspension architecture. 15 more cars, also prepared by Bill Strope Engineering, were completed in 1965, each equipped with K-Code 289 high-post small block motivation, topped by either a single Holley 4-barrel, dual Holleys, which cost $249 extra, or a quartet of Weber downdraft carburetors, which added $595 to the tab. The base price was $4,776, and these were 2,600-pound cars, and they were available from any adventurous Lincoln Mercury dealer ready to accept the realization that the same $4,776 could also purchase a loaded 1965 Mercury Park Lane convertible with $1,000 left over. But as I say, win on Sunday, sell on Monday. Now, I mentioned these cars, the 289 Cyclones, and they were built for BFX competition, which of course is the B category of the factory experimental drag world. The AFX, of course, which is the pinnacle of factory experimental, that is where the 427 camber and pushrod engines that we just described in Fact 561 would have lived. In fact, Mother's Waxes, I believe it is, in California, when they tour with their display of waxes and polishes and things like that, they also bring along a beautiful bright red 65 BFX Comet with the Weber carbureted 289. It's an unrestored car, and if you ever get a chance, go to the Mother's exhibit at SEMA or Barrett-Jackson or wherever. You get an eyeball full of what the original BFX Comets look like. Very, very cool cars. But again, they had stock inner fenders and suspension versus the radically reworked stuff found on the AFX Cammer cars. Okay, move along. Fact 563 and more FX information. Ford specified retention of Kelsey Hayes front disc brakes on its fleet of 1965 427 Mustangs because each car was based on a K-Code 2+2 Mustang fastback. That was easy to do. Over at Mercury, recognizing the many benefits of lower unsprung weight and overall mass on the drag strip, Bill Strope Engineering traded stopping power for reduced mass by specifying stock 10-inch drum brakes on all 427 and 289 factory experimental Comet Cyclones. The itemized weight of a typical drum brake, including the backing plate, wheel cylinder, and shoe set, is generally much less than the heft of a brake rotor, hub, caliper, brake pads, and caliper of a disc brake setup. And because drag racing rarely involves repeated severe braking episodes, the stuff of brake fade nightmares, drum brakes were very good. And it is a fact, yeah, while the Ford FX cars had those disc brakes up front, the Mercury stuff used drums. You know, again, these cars were designed to be similar, but not necessarily identical. Okay, fact 564, let's move up into the world of the Cougar. The 1968 Cougar GTE was easily identified by its bold silver-gray argent lower body paint treatment. Domed hood bustle on the 427 only cars. The 428s used a forward-facing scoop. Quad outlet exhaust tips, blacked out grille, and the rumble of a standard 427 W code V8 or R code 428 on those cars built after May of 1968. But did you know that radial tires were planned for but never delivered? Dealer sales materials describe standard FR70 by 14 red or white stripe radial tires for the GTE, but none are known to have been factory installed. Instead, GTEs were fitted with F7014 Firestone Super Sports wide oval or Goodyear Speedway Ride Tread tires. As for radial tires, 1968 Cougar price guides do show FR7014 tires as being optional at $38.95 when the GT group was chosen. For this price, you got 5 tires, which included the spare. The 1968 Montego price chart lists FR70 by 14 radials for $121.75, while full-size Mercury Monterey, Montclair, Park Lane, and Marquis offered 205 and 215 R15 radial tires for $58 to $116.92. So yeah, we often think of the radial tires being a product of the 1970s and the need to have lower rolling resistance for better fuel economy. And that was a major benefit of the radial tire. But yes, you could get radials on your Ford product as early as 1968. But again, they were not standard on the Cougar GTE, although they were planned for. Okay, moving along, let's go to fact number 565. Muscle-era Mercuries are known for their excellent drag strip traction. Much of the credit goes to their leaf spring rear suspension, shared model for model with Ford. Competing GM muscle intermediates like the Chevelle SS, Buick Grand Sport, Olds 442, Pontiac GTO were stuck with coil-sprung rear suspension layouts, which may have offered a smoother boulevard ride, but were prone to axle hop on hard acceleration. Yeah, and you guys might know me, of course, as being something of a Mopar guy at the core, but I certainly can appreciate really any vehicle of any kind. But, I have a soft spot for all GM and Ford products, no doubt about that. But it is true that, Mopars have leaf spring rear suspensions, as did many of the Ford muscle cars of the day. And the beauty of the leaf spring really is it kind of has a built-in traction bar. Axle hop, that sort of thing can happen, but it's not as readily encountered as it is on a coil spring car. But by contrast, if you want a nice soft ride, the coil springs are far better. You choose. Okay, moving on, let's get kind of exotic here with some Italian goodies with fact 566. Don't plan on swapping wheels between your De Tomaso Mangusta and De Tomaso Pantera. Though both cars use exotic cast magnesium rims, the Mangusta's 4-lug hubs don't accept the Pantera's 5-lug wheels. The same goes for certain Comets. 6-cylinder cars typically came with 4-lug wheels, while the V8s came with 5 lugs. And over at Ford, base 6-cylinder Mustangs with the standard issue non-heavy-duty drum brakes were fitted with 4 lugs up till 1973. Mercury's more refined Cougar rolled on 5-lug wheels from 1967 through 1979. Yeah, the 4-lug wheel thing, well, got to remember that the Mustang evolved out of the Falcon, as did the Comet, or Cougar, excuse me. Now, the Cougar, of course, was a little bit larger, and it's actually more correct to say that car grew out of the Fairlane. But again, 4-lug wheels were certainly seen on a lot of those old Fords. And yes, the De Tomaso Mangusta, there we go, had 4-lug wheels in original condition, whereas the Pantera came with 5. So yeah, differences abound. Okay, moving on. More Comet goodies with 567. The biggest problem facing the 6 Comets entered in the 1964 East African Safari was shock absorber failure. Ford's Autolite division designed extra-duty shock absorbers only to have them fail during practice runs. No fewer than 5 progressively stronger sets were tried before the race. In combat, the shocks turned out to be okay, but the elevated 3,800-pound curb weight of each rally-fortified Comet, which is 600 pounds greater than stock, took its toll on those shock absorbers. The next weakest link was the shock mounts on the Comet's frame and axle, which tore away from the brutal punishment of the unpaved roads. Despite being shockless, the Comets pressed on, 2 of the 6-car team finishing the rally in 18th place and 21st place. Yeah, it's not often remembered, but back in '64, the East African Safari was a torture test that Mercury sent a bunch of Comets on. And again, keep in mind the Comet was a fairly new car, so they wanted to prove its merits by entering in this torture test. In fact, Hot Rod Magazine and Motor Trend both did lengthy feature stories on the progress of those Comets. But you can bet that their problems with the shock absorbers were not front page news. They kept them quiet. But it is true that a lot of those cars did complete the race with some of the shock absorbers either ripped away or flapping around because they'd torn loose. Live and learn. Okay, let's move on to the Cougar with fact 568. Cougar marketing material claimed the new 1967 Cougar had a 15% better ride than Mustang. But if the 2 cars shared platforms, how is this possible? Well, beside the calming effect of Cougar's 3-inch longer wheelbase, the radius struts, which link the lower control arms to the front of the frame, were designed with curved ends rather than straight ends as used on Mustangs. Extra thick rubber bushings also help differentiate between Cougar and Mustang handling traits. And, while the Mustang and the Cougar were similar, they certainly were not the same car. In fact, over at General Motors, the Camaro and Firebird actually had a lot more in common than did a Mustang from a Cougar. Again, it was similar, but not the same. In fact, leaf springs at the rear were different. And I think we're going to get to that in a few minutes here in more of these facts. Speaking of which, let's go to fact 569 and get into those leaf springs. Did you hear about the guy who bought a set of 67 Mustang leaf springs at a swap meet for his 1967 Cougar? They didn't fit. That's because Cougar leaf springs are 6 inches longer, eye to eye, than Mustang springs. Remember, Mercury planners initially wanted the Cougar to be more of a junior Thunderbird than an upmarket Mustang. As such, plush handling, easily achieved with longer leaf springs, was a greater priority than the economy of parts sharing with the Mustang. So again, Mustang and Cougar, not the same. Similar, but not identical. Okay, let's talk about suspension parts with 570, Fact 570 that is. Dana Spicer has been making automotive rear axles for nearly a century. Mostly remembered for the use under the 3/4-ton pickup trucks and 1960s Mopar muscle cars, did you know that Mercury, but not Ford, was also a big Dana axle customer? When the 1949 Mercury chassis was designed, engineers abandoned the banjo-style torque tube rear axle and transverse leaf spring used since the first Mercury in 1939. Floor pan designers specified an open drive shaft so the transmission tunnel size could be reduced and rear suspension arc freed from its rigid attachment to the transmission, a la the torque tube. The search for a durable rear axle led Mercury and Lincoln to Dana's various Salisbury-style axles, which have removable inspection covers. The Dana 35 series, 37 series, 45 series, and 53 series all saw service under various Mercury passenger cars between 1949 and 1956, when the Ford 9-inch was phased in across the board. By contrast, in the same 1949 through 56 timeframe, Ford utilized an in-house Hotchkiss-style axle, which means that it has a drop-out center section versus the Salisbury's removable tin cover on the back. Those axles were not to be confused with the 1957 up 9-inch rear axle used by Ford. And it's true, another thing too that wasn't referenced in this book is that if you bought a Mercury, of course you got the Spicer rear axle, but if you bought a Ford station wagon, you got a Spicer axle as well. So if you have like a 49 through 51 Ford Woody, which is actually a steel-bodied car, you won't find the passenger car style Hotchkiss rear axle, but rather there will be a Salisbury style, like a Dana 44 under it, which is, again, shared with the Mercury Woody at the same time. But otherwise, Fords generally had a dropout style Hotchkiss rear axle, while the Mercury's used a Salisbury style. Now you know. Okay, moving on. More rear axle goodies with Fact 571. Though Mercury switched to Ford-sourced 9-inch axles for 1957, Lincoln continued use of the Dana 53 unit until the 1965 model year. With its 9-inch ring gear, the Model 53 Dana was stronger than the 8.5-inch gear ring in the Dana 45 used in Mercury passenger car applications. Incidentally, other passenger cars fitted with various Dana rear axles included Studebaker, Kaiser, Willys, and Fraser and Kaiser. Overseas, Jaguar, Volvo, and Jensen used Dana axles that were manufactured by GKN Driveline under license. So yeah, that's the story on that. Lincoln, apparently they didn't think the 9-inch was going to be tough enough for their 58, 59, 60, and onward type of vehicle. So again, they used the Dana 53, and something that viewers of Roadkill's Junkyard Gold might remember. I did an episode at Stevens Auto Wrecking, which is a Mopar yard in Anderson, Alabama, and we found a 1968 Plymouth Fury convertible. Now, it was an L code with the 440 4-barrel 4-speed. Now, if that was a Roadrunner or a GTX, there would be a Dana 60 rear axle under it. So you got to wonder, a full-size Fury, a larger car than a B-body GTX, what kind of axle would that have, right? Not an 8 3/4. Rather, we found a Dana 53 under that 68 4-speed Fury. Blew my mind, but it's a fact. And if you watch that episode of Roadkill's Junkyard Gold, you'll see us discover a Dana 53 under a C-body Plymouth. Yep, it happened, but only when the 440 and the 4-speed were specified. Okay, getting back to some Mercury lore, let's move on to Fact 572. Sensing the 9-inch ring gear diameter found in the Salisbury-style Dana 53 rear axle might not live behind the new for 66 462 cubic inch standard V8, Lincoln finally stopped using Dana axles in 1966. The replacement was a newly upsized version of the Ford-sourced 9-inch axle. To cope with the 462 cubic inch Lincoln's V8, which had 485 foot-pounds of torque, a 9 3/8 inch ring gear was adapted to the 9-inch housing, necessitating a pair of crescent-shaped notches for ring gear clearance during assembly. This 9 3/8 axle was also used under 1966 Ford Galaxies equipped with the 7-liter package and most 428-powered Mercury full-size cars. It is true, a lot of folks will find what they think is a Ford 9-inch rear axle in a junkyard in a large Lincoln, like a 67-8, and say, man, this is a great thing, especially when it has the traction log posi type differential. But the reality is, it's got a larger ring gear, 9 3/8, which is a 3/8 of an inch larger than a 9-inch. Go figure. Well, the trouble is, the gear ratios available for those things are extremely limited. Aftermarket companies like Zoom, Summit, or companies like that, they don't make ring and pinion sets for the 9 3/8 Lincoln-style Ford rear axle. So beware. Okay, let's move along to the fact number 573. NHRA stock eliminator drag racers intent on shedding every last ounce legally know to watch for 1982 Lincoln Bustle-back Continentals in the boneyard. That's because their 10 by 2-inch rear drum brakes feature aluminum drums that weigh half the mass of more common iron brake drums. These drums fit any Ford axle already equipped with 10 by 2-inch drums on the 5 on 4.5-inch wheel bolt pattern. A 1-year only deal for 1982. 1983 up Continentals are strictly out since they switched to standard 4-wheel disc brakes. Fox Capri Zephyr and Fox Ford cars are no-go because they use a smaller 9-inch drum and matched braking backing plate. But owners of 1960s Cougars and Cyclones can benefit from the reduced unsprung mass. And it's true, a lot of folks think an aluminum brake drum, isn't that just Buick stuff? Well, it's true. 1959 or so through 69, Buick did come with massive 12-inch aluminum drums, only on the front. But you got to remember that Ford messed with them too, as did General Motors, in fact, in the late 70s, early 80s on Grand Nationals, Monte Carlo, stuff like that. Sometimes you find aluminum drums on the backs of those as well. But yeah, if you find an 82 Lincoln Continental, the kind with that weird bustle back, you're going to find aluminum drums on the tail, and yep, they can be used on a 10-inch drum replacement. Okay, more Fox Body goodies with fact 574. Fox Body Capri and Zephyr owners looking for direct fit aluminum rear brake drums can find them on 2.3-liter turbo-powered Capris of 1979 through 84 vintage and Zephyrs in 1980. Over the fence at Ford, the 1979 Mustang Indy pace car and all pre-SVO turbocharged Fox Body Mustangs and Fairmonts built in 79 through 84, and Fairmonts only in 1980, were also built with aluminum rear brake drums. Measuring 9 inches and having the standard Fox 4-lug wheel pattern, they're a direct fit for Fox Body cars equipped with cast iron drums. SVO Mustangs are out since they graduated to 4-wheel disc brakes and 5-lug wheels, which are not as easy to interchange. Yeah, I happen to know from personal experience about these Fox Mustang style aluminum drums. I've got a car called the Funny Fairmont. You might have seen it online or maybe in some of the magazines. It's basically an 81 Ford Fairmont two-door post with a 4.6-liter Mustang Mach 1 4-valve 4-cam engine in it. Well, I have an 8.8 Ford Mustang rear axle, and it's a drum brake type deal, but online I found one new old stock aluminum drum. So I put it on there because it's exotic, and what the heck, it belongs on my exotic funny car. Well, I didn't have a second one, so what I did is I took a regular iron drum and I painted the outer perimeter with sort of a flat aluminum paint, so it kind of looks like the other one, but it's our little secret, don't tell anybody. Okay, moving on, fact 575. Despite the fact Lincoln Continentals, Ford Thunderbirds, and Mustangs could be had with front disc brakes as early as 1965, the first Mercury performance car fitted with front disc brakes was the 1966 full-size S55. Its 11-inch vented discs were shared with the 7-liter Galaxy. By 1967, front disc brakes were standard equipment on full-size S55 Cyclone GTs and Cougar GTs. Yeah, disc brakes were, well, long in coming, I guess you might say. Studebaker had them way back in '62, but the big three were late to embrace disc brakes, largely because of their cost versus drums. Moving on, more brake tech with fact 576. Okay, Chris is telling me we have to do a commercial. Okay, here we go. The Steve Max Muscle Car Show podcast is brought to you by High Octane Classics, the Northeast's largest muscle car and supercar dealership, located at 143 Washington Street in Auburn, Massachusetts. High Octane Classics buys and sells and services muscle cars and exotics. Call them at 508-859-4515. What?
We're done.
We're done. Oh, we're done. Oh, good. Okay, well, that's a half hour. So we're going to wrap it up right here with Fact 576, and we'll see you on the next episode, which I think is going to be show 40. We'll see you then. And again, keep in mind, the Steve Max Muscle Car Show, again, is brought to you by High Octane Classics. Great people over there. They have a wide variety of everything from Ford Mustangs to Ferraris. Check them out over in Auburn, Massachusetts, or call them at 508-859-4515. And be sure to go to stevemags.com to see my blogs and some merchandise you might want to pick up. And of course, the Steve Magnante YouTube channel where you'll see this video and other stuff. So we'll see you next time.